So I'm going to tell you basically my entire career as an academic, starting with my dissertation, which was in political philosophy. So most of the people in ethics come in through moral theory, or I come in through political philosophy. So I'm interested, I think, in groups and not so much as individual decisions. I like to put them in context. Secondly, the subject I chose for my dissertation was social contract theory, not modern social contract theory, which was very popular at the time, Rawls and all that, but Locke and Hobbes. And that interest I've kept my entire career. In fact, the last couple of years, I published 3 papers. Well, not a couple of dozen years. I've published 3 or 4 papers on Locke, some of which have actually been noticed. So, how did I end up being interested in professional ethics or practical ethics? Well, it really started by accident, and in some ways, it's the story of my career. One day, the chairman of my department at Case Western Reserve University called me in to his office. Now, I was a first semester assistant professor of philosophy.
Did you start your career at Case Western teaching?
Teaching, well, apart from graduate teaching at Michigan, I taught as a TA at Michigan for 3 or 4 years, and then 5 years actually. And then my first real job was Case Western Reserve. And it was a nice place to teach because I graduated from there when it was Western Reserve University, so I knew most of the faculty. It was also not a good place because it took me like a year to the point where I could call the senior faculty members by their first names. And I didn't want to call them by their last names, a professor, so I didn't call them anything. It was very embarrassing. But anyway, he called me into his office and said, I've just been on the phone with the dean of the law school, and they're looking for somebody to teach legal ethics next year. So I said, well, I know about ethics, and I know about the law because I do philosophy of law, but I don't know what legal ethics is. And he said, you're a smart guy, you'll figure it out. So I was sent over. The dean of the law school was a very sensible person, and he offered me the fall as no teaching, just for research and to develop a curriculum, and the spring to teach a course. I also learned from him that the reason they wanted to teach the course is because the Illinois Bar Association, the Illinois Supreme Court had just mandated a legal ethics course as a condition of being allowed to take the bar exam. Now, if you can't take the bar exam, you can't be a lawyer in Illinois, and everybody who wants to be a lawyer has to take the test.
Is this a case in Ohio?
What?
Case Western.
Was this a Case Western in Ohio?
Yes. Where else would it be?
Well, you were talking about the Illinois.
Oh, it's the
Supreme Court. You meant the Ohio.
The Ohio Supreme Court, yeah.
Right. Okay.
The Ohio Supreme Court. That's absolutely right. Thank you.
That's okay.
So there was a panic because most of the law schools in Illinois, here I go again, Ohio. I've lived too long. I grew up in Ohio, and I've now transferred my loyalties to Illinois.
I see that.
But anyway, the Supreme Court was really upset with Nixon's lawyers, and they couldn't believe that the lawyers didn't know these things that are like the big thing. The non-lawyers didn't appreciate this, but the lawyers noticed it right away when John Dean took money out of the safe on Friday and put it back on Monday. That was client money. He commingled it with his own funds. Didn't even take out all the money out of his wallet before he put in the other stuff. that's for lawyers, that was like the worst crime. And they didn't know that. He didn't know that. They put the mandate. But they didn't want to teach the course the way it had been taught in the 20s and 30s and 40s, because apparently sometime in the 50s the students had lost interest in that course. I never found out what it was about the course that did that, but there had been this gap. So I started out fresh, and I started out just trying to teach a course that would give some ethics, and then you'd apply the ethics to particular problems, sort of natural way for philosophy to go. And it wasn't such a bad course, but I definitely felt myself fighting against the flow of the stream. And I was thinking about how to do better. But that was my end of my career at Western Reserve. My 1-year appointment, then this thing. So I went on to Illinois State. And there they had undergraduate pre-law majors. And the pre-law majors thought it seemed like they'd be the natural audience for teaching legal ethics. And so they were. So I taught the course there, I think, about 6 times, all the years I was there. And while I was there, now this is all legal ethics, not really thinking about how it connects up with anything else. And actually, this had brought me up to 1982 or 84. There was really nothing, except for medical ethics, there's really no field of professional ethics or business ethics was just starting. We did have a course in business ethics in Illinois State, taught by a former business guy who had a philosophy degree and taught almost nothing else. And one day he came in and said, "You're teaching legal ethics, right?" I said, "Yes." "And you cover conflict of interest." I said, "Of course." He said, "Well, I just used this paper, I've forgotten the guy's name now, but he taught at Cincinnati. Anyway, he'd written a paper on what is conflict of interest. And it looked good, and then he tried it out in class, and the students just not only didn't catch on to what the guy was saying, but the whole discussion about conflict of interest fell apart. They were lost. And furthermore, by the time he was done, he was lost. And so he asked me what I did, and I kind of described. He said, "That sounds good. Can you put that on paper?" So I did. I wrote a 3-page thing he could hand out. And the class went well. He told me following semester it went well. And that was the end of it until a year later, he got a memorandum in the mail from Bob Baum about the Journal of Business and Professional Ethics being set up. He said,
Bob Baum.
"What?"
Bob Baum.
Yeah, Bob Baum. And he, this guy I'm talking about, Andre, said to me, "Well, this is your chance to publish there." Because where else, he knew I had the ideas, so I wrote out a paper, and after having a look at it, we sent it in, and Bob made me cut out half or 2/3 of it and put in more examples. And then they published it. So a couple of years later, I got a call from Chicago, from not Jack Snapper. I think it was the person who actually did the calling. But it was from the Ethics Center up there. Now you'll notice that the way I'm telling the story, the Ethics Center already existed a couple of years before I had any contact with it.
And this is at Illinois Institute.
And tell where it is.
Yeah, Illinois, not Ohio Institute of Technology.
No, you just say it's Illinois Institute on the video.
Well, actually, these days I'm supposed to say Illinois Tech.
They are
Oh,
indeed.
all right.
But anyway, IIT. They asked me up to present a discussion of engineers and conflict of interest. And I had to break it to Jack that I knew nothing, or I thought I knew nothing about engineers. And so it's not going to be much of a discussion. We said, you present your conflict of interest stuff, and then we'll tell you what you need to know, and then you can tell us what we want to know. And so I gave the paper, and it went very much like that. But in the course of doing that, I learned that engineers are like lawyers in that they make lots of documents. I always thought they were just mathematics and otherwise illiterate. Is that true? Also, they had a code of ethics, which looked a lot like the lawyer's code. And they had ethics boards, which were like the lawyers I'd seen. So they structurally looked very similar. And I commented on that. And then Vivian asked me to write a paper on conflict of interest for their series they were putting out, modules in ethical issues in engineering. And she also suggested a case I could look at, which seemed suggested because it was in the news at the time, and because it was already in the document which I was not the first person to work on this project. There were two others, Hardy Jones, who was a ethicist, philosopher of ethics at University of Nebraska, and another person, a engineer in who was high up in the same organization of engineers that was having this ethics case. Hardy Jones had committed suicide. I didn't know at the time. It seemed like ominous that he might have thrown himself. He threw himself out of the top floor window of the tallest building between Chicago and Denver.
So anyway,
that sort of ended his career, and he was doing the drafting. She wasn't. So I got a bunch of documents from him. There were information about the cases, and then there was a paper which was about moral theory, but never made the connection with conflict of interest. So for me, it was essentially useless. So I rewrote it and showed it to her. She thought it was good. We put it in a module. And then she came up with another module on moral theory for the collection. And I wrote that one as well, but it was not published at the time because the publisher had decided they had enough of these modules because they weren't selling. So that one lay around for 15 or 20 years and now exists online. So that was the start of my career in engineering ethics. Now, when did I get interested in business ethics? I never got interested in business ethics.
that's all right.
I did teach the course regularly for a number of years.
This is about applied ethics in general.
Yes, but the thing is, I always inserted the professions into the business ethics course. Accountants here, lawyers there, engineers here, and so forth. And at IIT, where I was teaching, this made perfectly sense because there actually were very few business majors, pure business majors. They always had this other thing with them. But in the course of doing that, I ended up writing a number of papers because of spin-offs where I was invited. Because the people in business didn't realize I wasn't in business ethics. What? No,
So when did you get interested in API and started coming here?
The first year, the year API was set up, which I guess would be year zero.
Probably about 1991, 1990.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that's for our purposes. Yeah.
Right, year zero, where there was no API, but they set it up. And there was part of a conference, it was a sideshow to a conference at U of I, or IU, I guess. Indiana. This is going to be huge, all these guys here. Indiana University, they had that conference, and then right next to it they had this founding of API. Many of the people were also at the conference. Now, I had no idea what happy would look like. There are people like Vivian who knew what they were doing. I had no idea. So I didn't even attend the meetings. I went to the conference. I remember giving a paper in which Bernie, I'm going to say Sanders. That's
I don't think so. Bernie Carlson?
No, from
What doesn't matter?
Hanover.
Oh, Bernie Gert.
Very, very good. Right. Yeah, I'm sorry to forget his name.
Sorry,
Anyway, I gave a paper which he got up after the paper and said, this is very polite, there are things in your paper which about how you conceptualize moral theory, morality, which is similar to my view. And I said, no, it is your view. All I did was accept your theory of morality, but when I talked about ethics, I did it under Rule, I think 10 it would have been, but one of the, like, law. And that I found it very helpful to do it that way, and I recommend everybody to do it that way. And he never, it was an obvious giveaway to him. He could connect his theory up with this thing and have it all. He never accepted that. He always rejected. He thought professional ethics or business ethics was just morality with special facts. And I gave him reasons for thinking he was wrong by the cases they gave, and he never accepted it. So one of the pleasant experiences of my life was arguing with Bernie each year at the conference. And he did several versions of his book, so I couldn't just stick with one. I had to read the next one and then criticize that. So that was kind of like what was API was like. It was always this conversation, people who cared about those issues, and in a world where almost nobody else did.
Is API still like that?
Yeah. It's a little harder now because the very junior people don't argue with the very senior people, although they should.
How would you make that happen?
Well, I would. One thing that we used to have, I think at API, but we always had at APA, were speakers and critics, and that would probably a few, not all the time, but a few sessions every year, and let the young guys beat up on the old guys. And they'll make friends that way. So that would be my suggestion on that. That was off the topic. How do you make API more relevant? I'm still telling the story. So far, it's just talking about teaching and writing papers. And the papers, people often ask me, how can you write so many papers? Well, usually, somebody comes, I say of myself, I'm still an undergraduate. If you give me a topic, I'll write on it, as long as it's a good topic. And Vivian used to do that. Vivian, this is the director of the Ethics Center, used to, when we sit around in the afternoon, she never stopped working. I thought I was having, years later I realized I wasn't having conversations with her, but at the time, I thought I was having conversations with her, and she was trying to increase the publications of the Ethics Center and do research on her own projects. So she'd throw out ideas which seemed off the cuff, and she could get away with it being off the cuff because everybody thought of her as a little scattered. Anyway, but she wasn't. Anyway, so she'd throw out these things, and I'd say, oh, that's absolutely wrong. And she'd say, why? And I'd say some reasons off the top of my head. She'd say, I don't remember seeing any of that in the literature. And in those days, you could do a full search of the applied ethics literature. It's a little harder now. So I just read through the things, and it wasn't there. So I had a publication, just write it out. And that's basically most of the writing. The other way I've ended up with writing is people coming in with a question from professional society. We'd like you to do a paper on a talk on this subject. And if the talk went over well, I then expand it. But all of my practical writing in practical ethics was practical in the sense it was stuff that people wanted to know about. When I do Locke, I throw out the ideas and hope somebody out there cares. I don't expect people, I don't have people coming, beating at the doors, demanding stuff from me. So that's why most of my publications are in applied philosophy. And I think it's good to have an audience you have in mind when you're writing the paper, and try to be useful in what you say. It doesn't have to be very sophisticated. Some of the papers that have done really well over the years have been, from philosophers' perspective, very unsophisticated, but they provided guidance in the area, clarified some things, provided guidance that people then went on and read them, republished them. And I have one paper on our public administrators' profession. That was for a conference initially. And I did it. No, that was not for a conference. That was for a volume on ethics in journalism. Anyway, that's what. And it was just a throwaway paper because all the analysis I had done earlier for engineers and lawyers. And it's been one of my best sellers. I don't sell things. I actually just give them away. But people there are things like ResearchGate now. They track usage. And it's really a big use thing. But I did the same thing for another group on whether journalism is a profession. And that also was a big hit because everybody else was telling me they weren't a profession.
Michael, you worked at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and you had some affiliation, you mentioned, with Vivian Weil, who was the...
Not some affiliation. She was my half-boss.
She was your half-boss. I wanted you to clarify how it is you worked with Vivian and the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions at IIT. How did that all work?
IIT is a poor school. So that's poor with dollar signs. The center was founded because somebody gave money. At the time it was anonymous. We later learned it was the chairman of the philosophy section at IIT. The giver gave the money because she thought that philosophers at IIT had no focus. She wanted to give them something special to do. And she also had an interest in ethics in the professions. Her husband was a lawyer, legal ethics issues at times, and she had engineers in the family. In fact, they made their money in engineering projects. So she was kind of upset with the scandals Dixon scandals in the 60s, 70s, and then the engineer scandals in the 70s and early 80s. So she donated this money in 1982, I think. And the person who she had to spend a lot of time with I don't think they're called the advance. The trouble with raising money is it's one of those disgraceful activities, so they constantly change their names every few years so you don't recognize them by their name. I think it might have been Advancement at the time, but they changed the name again recently. And it might have just been fundraising, alumni services, something like that. Anyway, she had to work out something to do with the money for the philosophers. And they came up with the idea of an ethics center because at that time there was an ethics center, which had been a big hit. That was the Hastings Center. It's been in existence for 10 years. It was well known and had done a lot of good things, not only for medical ethics, but for this very beginning field of professional ethics.
So, was Vivian the first director?
No, she wasn't. Mark Frankel was the first director, and he was there for like 4 or 5 years, and it was always a struggle for him. And we never understood why, because of course it was a big hit once he left IIT and went to the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he had been successful before, but he never hooked up with the engineers. He did hook up with the scientists, some of the scientists, but always the social scientists. And IIT was too small for that. So he was out in 1986, just as I arrived. Vivian volunteered to do it as a temporary, because they didn't have anybody else, and Bob refused. And then she, when they opened up the job for permanent hire, she threw her hat in. And first time around, she didn't get it. So went to somebody who was running a medical ethics center someplace in central Illinois, probably at the U of I Medical Center in Springfield. But at the last minute, he dropped out. It's like the 15th of August, or 20th of August, he said, no, I changed my mind, I'm not coming up. And so Vivian, they opened up the thing again, and she threw her hat in again, and this time they accepted her. So she became director. And really, in terms of qualifications, I don't know, apart from being there, I don't know what the qualifications were, which is worrisome because our attempts where we did have qualifications, we got the wrong people. So then she was there, and she did well with engineers, and she also had a way of working with scientists that Frankel didn't have. He accepted the view that you have the ethics thing added at the end. You may notice I come back to this thing every so often, and in my experience, this is always a bad thing. She wanted to have the philosophers in the process of writing the proposal and produce a lot of the conceptual work near the beginning, which is absolutely the right way to do it. And she made friends with Rochelle Hollander. I don't know if I should tell this story. You can edit this out. This may be no longer...
Sure.
What?
Okay, go ahead.
No longer proper. But when I was at Michigan, the chairman of the department brought in several $100,000 grants, which is a lot of money in 1970, 71, from the Davenport Foundation in Missouri. They're the ones who do chemicals, I think, including for
Danforth or
Davenport?
No, Davenport is a town. Danforth is a family.
Right.
And this guy was there's a foundation for that family, and they give money.
Right.
And they usually do it on social projects, but Brandt got these couple of big grants for Michigan Philosophy Department. And so I asked him, I was very invasive. I asked him a lot of hard questions over the years. I asked him, how did he manage to get the grants? And he said, it's my early experience with conflict of interest. Try sleeping with the director. So he was kind of prostituting himself. What?
That's a story.
Michael, can I ask you
Gross. Okay.
from the beginning of your career to now, to today, are the challenges the same? Are they different? Are your responses the same, or are they different?
A lot of the issues are the same, but there are a lot of new ones. And also, sometimes the things that passed as okay earlier suddenly don't look that good anymore. That's why when I told the story, the point I was going to make is Vivian, she didn't prostitute or anything, but she had a long-term relationship with Rochelle Hollander going back to their days at Rensselaer.
Michelle Hollander was the head of the National Science Foundation.
Section on that did well. It's changed its name a lot of times, but for our purposes, there was a section of ethics. Yes. Often the ethics wasn't even in the title, but for us it was that. And she herself was really interested in the ethics and the philosophy, and they were long-term friends. So she could try out ideas on the director. Anybody actually can do this, but not many people have the nerve to do that. And she did it. So over the years, Vivian knew what was the next step. She had proposals ready to go when the proposals were announced. And she also had a gift for bringing in people who would work with her. So we often had a board of advisors on a project drawn from, like if you're doing a software engineers project, you had a bunch of software engineers as among the people on the panel. So that was, and I haven't really told this story, right? But the fact is that the first 5 or 6 years I was at IIT, I was Vivian's student in engineering ethics. I had my own big ideas on professions, but for engineering ethics, she really introduced me to the people, which is always important, a lot of the issues, and also she helped me see where things weren't thought out very well. So it was a place for me. I like cleaning up messes. I don't like starting them.
So, Michael, as you look ahead, what are the future issues that we are going to be dealing with as you look at ethics in the professions?
Right now, it seems to me that the future, next few years, is trying to decide how much engineering adjusts to local circumstances and how much of it is to be international. Now, on that continuum, I'm at the left, right end maybe. But I think that the point of having engineers is to have rigidity. If you want people who are good with the locals and can make compromises and so on, that's what management's for. And for managers to do that is okay. But for an engineer, if an engineer signs off on something, it's got to meet engineering standards. And when I teach engineering ethics, the engineers, the class loves me for that hardline view. When I do business ethics, everybody hates me. Because they expect not only that they should adjust, but they expect everybody under them to do it, even if they're professionals.
Did you have any other questions?
Well, I'd like to know, if you were to give advice to anybody like yourself when you were starting up, so somebody now, what would you say to them?
If we're starting now, first of all, I would like somebody to start a program, graduate program in Ph.D. in engineering ethics in particular, and in professional ethics in general. Not business ethics, there are plenty of those. But for some reason, professional ethics has not been able to get much of a root in academia, and that's a hole in our thinking. And once you had such a program, it'd be easier to have courses in professional ethics in the better schools than other schools. And it's a practice. If you have a program in a profession, having one of these things plugged in is a natural. So it should be there, but it isn't. It won't come from the engineers because engineers divide the world up in a certain number of ways. And ethics is in each of the programs, but there's nobody who's going to teach ethics as a separate department. What?
So you think there should be a course of professional ethics?
Well, I think I think it'd be better to do it profession by profession, but you need a department which tolerates the kind of thinking and writing that makes up professional ethics. And the engineering school, at least now, doesn't. And that's a real problem. And the law schools have been able to generate a lot of literature in legal ethics, and they teach courses, so that's okay. The accountants aren't so good. They end up, a lot of their publications are in business ethics. Anyway, you can go through the list. And if you want for journalism ethics, there is a movement to put journalism ethics as a course in journalism schools, but it's not that successful yet. Or people want to say they're not really journalists, they're newsmen, or media, mediums, whatever. Anyway, so I think that's one problem for all the young people, to say most of them end up learning to do ethics, practice the way I did. Essentially throw them in the pool and hope they survive. And that's not good. It's not that it's not a good way to learn. It's not a good way to teach. After that, I've been working with some people who set standards for earthquakes for the U.S. And they've been trying to figure out ways for engineers to incorporate public opinion into the setting of standards, because it matters. How does it matter? Well, the engineers in 1910 or something were told decided they needed standards for buildings. So he said, what do we want from a building? We don't want it to fall down. This is a typical engineer thing. And to this day, they've never adopted a standard which says the building should not only not fall down, but it should be usable right after. And for the local pinball alley, no problem. You can do without that for weeks or months, even years. But the hospital, the police department, the fire department, that stuff should be back in use right away. And your house not too long after that. But how do you convince the engineers to change the standards? Well, bring in the public. How do you bring in the public? That's what we're interested in.
So that's a good topic for Happy.
Yes, and there's another one. I'm sorry to be focused on engineers, but really this is what I've done for the last 30 years. The engineers think engineering judgment is important, and I agree. But what they don't realize is how unreliable engineering judgment is. And every good engineer can tell you stories about one of the requirements in the general standards that have been there for a long time, which in fact don't make sense or do the opposite of what they were supposed to. Everybody thinks it's safer to have white lines along the side of the road before you hit the gravel. It's okay. It actually is a good thing if you're on a curve. But if you're on the straight, people tend to then think that they can get up to the white line and there's no risk. But by the time you're up to the white line, you're in danger of going off. So it's just safer if you don't have a white line. People are more worried about the side. They drive more carefully.
So there's lots more work to be done.
There is, and a lot of it is standard setting, the criterion for what public interest is. Every time everybody says diversity, you know there's a problem about what the public interest is. And if you don't have public interest, then the engineers don't have any standards to go by. They don't know how to develop the standards.
Well, that's great things for Happy, I think. I think we're going to have to do one last word, because I think we're going to have to pull up.
I think that everybody who does fly in professional ethics should also keep a sideline in theory.
Good.
Because you lose your edge after a while if you don't.